Good evening and welcome to another art stream with myself, Pharaoh, and co-hosts, genii of the artistic world, Alexander Adams and Panama Hat. Alexander, how are you doing today?
Greetings. Diversity is our strength, comrades.
This is sort of like your catchphrase now for the show.
This is my get out clause in case someone clips something later on in the stream.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I would. Yeah. Panama, do you also love?
Yes. I would love to reiterate what Alexander said. We have nothing. We have nothing to lose but our chains. I love the nation of Israel. Yes. Yes, I'm doing all right. Spent most of today outside getting soaked in the Welsh rains, which are incessant as usual. But that's just how it is.
Lovely. Well, yeah, the weather's been a bit strange, but
taken a turn, hasn't it?
No, exactly. And I guess just to kind of summarise what we're looking at today, as part of this series, The Art of Darkness, we're delving into I guess the kind of not often looked at from a kind of a totally value-free perspective period of art during the kind of run up to the Second World War, specifically the different fascist and authoritarian regimes. Last week we ended up looking at Mussolini and the Italian fascist movement, and I thought it was very interesting. Lots of
some quite wonderful things, weren't there?
Yeah, exactly. And I think my view was that I think it was a definitely an intelligent and intellectual movement with some artists that you wouldn't necessarily, when people think of, authoritative art, it's the classic return meme. But again, some very forward-thinking and futuristic stuff. So
I think, as a kind of like sort of short recap to last week, the conclusion we basically reached with the Italians is that even if it you could say it kind of was forced to fail by the circumstances, the art of that era and that country was an attempt by anti-liberal forces to or at least anti-progressive elements to sort of move art forward in a way of their own. They weren't just being regressive; they were actively trying to build something new. Which even if that fails, it's still an enormously admirable thing to do. It's an enormously sort of valuable thing to have. Is to say that you've tried to do that, even if it doesn't quite add up in the end.
Yeah. And today we're going to be looking and turning towards the Germans. And I guess from my perspective, the contrast is unbelievably marked. A lot of German art during this period is kind of tied into the ideology. It's not necessarily intellectual in the same way as the Italians. There is also a huge amount of art being used as a propaganda tool. That was true to a degree with the Italians, but I think that's certainly ramped up. And also the kind of creation of the ideas of kind of degenerate art versus state-approved art, and also the kind of general Nazi looting that goes on. I think one thing that was interesting about the Italians was I don't know if there was much looting at all, but certainly the Italians were not famous for for doing that in the same kind of way. So
no,
the German approach is exceedingly different to the Italians, and hopefully we'll be looking at a few kind of key areas for that today.
Just to add, one thing I found out a few days ago that I didn't bring up on the last stream, I don't think, was that as part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany actually had to give away a huge number of artworks and sort of classical pieces, things that are worth enormous amounts, as part of the sort of, it was almost like a sort of guarantee on the money they were going to then have to pay. It was sort of like that. Well, like at the end of the war, we literally have nothing. So here's like some of the only valuable things we still have. It's the artworks. So I think there was when it comes to the looting, a kind of vengeance to it, because I know that particularly among the more educated parts of German society, that was seen as a huge outrage. The fact that all these sort of great cultural pieces were taken from them.
Yeah, there's definitely something more guttural, more something about the very spirit itself, and I think that sort of comes through in their kind of handling of art during that period. But before we kind of dive in too much, I know Alex, you had a kind of a few things you wanted to kind of chat beforehand, like follow-ups from the last stream.
Yeah, thanks, Pharaoh. So we always like your comments. Read your comments during the show. Try and respond during the show. If we don't, then we go back and we look at the comments afterwards in the YouTube comments section, which is unusually civilized and well informed. So keeping up the standards of the channel.
Testament to your channel, Pharaoh.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we had 2 points that I thought were worth mentioning. So Metaphysics pointed out that we were rather loose with our definitions of fascism, and we tended to speak about fascism as automatically including the National Socialism of Germany, Francoism in Spain as well. I guess it's a he. I think he's correct. Yes. I mean, I think we're talking about different forms of the same movement. So it's like talking about Quakerism and Calvinism. They're both forms of Christianity, but they're both very different, and they have some quite different ideas, but they have more in common than they have more in opposition. So, but he's perfectly right, and we should. Well, I would like to be more accurate about stuff. So thanks for pointing that out. So I think we'll try and call stuff Nazi art or National Socialist art, and say fascism for Italy. I think it might be worth mentioning something about Franco in a minute. But Mr. Valdez asked about whether the Italian fascists and the Novecento made only secular art. Did they also make religious art? As I understand it, there was a big revival of Catholicism in the 1910s, and then there was the call to order, which sort of happened at the end of the First World War, which saw artists turning away from modernism, turning towards traditional forms, traditional subjects. And there was a revival of Christianity at that point also. So without knowing it, I would assume that there was an increase in religious painting during the 1920s and 1930s under the fascists, not specifically stimulated by the fascists, because I think the standoff between Mussolini and the Pope was kind of sort of tense, but sort of they basically decided to strike a truce. I mean, do you guys know anything more about that?
Would that be the Lateran treaties?
Yes, where Mussolini granted statehood to the Vatican City, I think.
It was a very, very major thing in the history of the Italian and the Vatican states, because, of course, as people know, prior to Italian unification, the Pope controlled not only all of Rome, but huge chunks of the Italian peninsula too were under straightforward papal control. And then, of course, when the liberals under Garibaldi rise up, obviously one of their big things is basically making decreasing the power of the Catholic Church. So they basically take over all the territory. They march on Rome, and I believe this may be wrong, but I believe that what the current Vatican was actually basically considered like a small fort that the Pope would sometimes sort of house, like, guests in at times. At least the sort of walled area, and then of course he retreats in there, and it becomes the sort of unofficial heart of Catholicism, because whereas previously it was sort of Rome in its entirety, now it's that, hence the title Bishop of Rome. Now it's just the Vatican sort of, I suppose, is it sort of like a fortress, because it does have walls, isn't it? Sort of the fortress
San Angelo, Castello San Angelo is actually yes, fortified.
Yeah. And so between the Pope it's between the establishment of the Italian state and the Lateran treaties, Italy and the Vatican are unofficial. Well, they're sort of in a state of war, and there's a huge amount of conflict between them, with the Pope refusing to recognize the Italian state and also this caused enormous problems for them. The Pope issued a commandment known as non expedite, which forbade all Catholics from voting for the Italian Parliament, which of course meant that at any one time you got a huge chunk of the populace abstaining from the vote, which meant that you had all these kind of either sort of very shaky fringe, either sort of liberal, socialist, sort of radical governments coming in, and caused obviously a lot of the trouble that Italy had. And then with the Lateran treaties, Mussolini is kind of it's his. I think it's perhaps other than, depending on when it was, I think other than the Corfu incident where he basically seizes Corfu from Greece by force, the Lateran Treaty was kind of his huge political sort of coup. You know, it was his big sort of diplomatic victory when he basically gets the Pope to sit down and recognize his government. So yeah, that's what happened there with the Lateran Treaty. I probably could have made that a bit shorter.
That's good.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very good. So in short, basically, I think there was an upsurge in Catholic art in Italy at that time. Whether or not that was actually stimulated by the fascists is sort of it was something that experts would know, but I don't happen to know. I did dig out. You remember we talked about Giorgio de Chirico, the metaphysical painter, Italian metaphysical painter, and I said that he wrote to Mussolini, and I have now found that letter. It's in a journal called Metaphysical Art. This is one of the volumes from 2013, and I'll just read you a very short paragraph. So it's Giorgio de Chirico. He's come back to Rome he's been traveling abroad. Comes back to Rome, and it's on the 18th of January, 1938. He writes, Duce, returning from New York and before going back to Paris where I live, I'm passing through Italy, and from Rome I permit myself to bring to your excellency's attention certain facts that I feel deeply about. Okay. Envy and indolence have led to my notoriety as an anti-fascist and anti-Italian. With view to my name remaining a secure recollection to your memory, I declare that I am a fascist and have been a party member for years, and that my work and renown have always brought honor to Italy in the world. So this is Giorgio de Chirico declaring his loyalty in 1938.
Interesting. I sort of love the Italian turn of phrase there as well. It's just it's almost kind of awkward at the start, but yeah, no, interesting.
The original. There's a facsimile of the actual letter, and there is the original printed in Italian, and there's an English translation. And this is actually published by the foundation, the Giorgio de Chirico Foundation. So props to them for actually sort of making this open, because obviously this is a. I know that we'll talk about Emil Nolde, and his estate, his museum has gone through various sort of acrobatic positions to try and sort of excuse not mentioning. Anyway, we'll get to that when it comes up.
Legal foo.
Yes.
Yeah.
I should also add the disclaimer that any praise you get, any praise you hear in this stream is not an endorsement of fascism or National Socialism, either the theory or the practice. So
it's a value-free analysis.
We are objective beings.
Exactly.
Yes, we're being positively Kantian about this.
Yes. Sapere aude.
Yeah. So briefly, I wanted to say a couple of things about Franco. If you haven't heard the Academic Agents stream about the Spanish Civil War, it's really, really good. I don't know if is it still up?
Yes.
Is he okay? If he hasn't, yeah, okay. So I was thinking he might have put it behind the paywall.
Paywalls, okay, yes, yeah, maybe.
But I mean, if it's still available, do listen to it because it's really, really good and quite eye-opening. So there's a question about, okay, whether or not Franco was a fascist is something we won't really go into because this is kind of outside that's something that they deal with. But the question is, of course, what was the situation of the arts under Franco after his victory in 1939? I think it's very much more close to the Italian fascism than to the German National Socialism. That's not to make a judgment on the exact nature of Franco's ideology, insofar as he had one, because it's interesting to note that there was the opening of the Picasso Museum in Barcelona in the 1960s, I think. Picasso was invited to exhibit, and he was invited to return to Spain, but he was famously said he would never return to Spain while Franco was alive. Franco outlived Picasso, so Picasso never got to return to Spain after the early 1930s. In terms of what the artists were doing under Franco, well, I mean, obviously there was a great revival of Catholic art, great increase in traditional art, but modernist art was not forbidden, and it was, I think, it was sort of tolerated, basically, because you have artists like Antonio de Sora, Antoni Tapí, and the surrealist Juan Miró, all producing sort of late modernist work, some abstract work. So not overtly political, but certainly overtly modernist. And this was certainly tolerated under Franco. And they apparently had no political problems with Franco, even though I think they were sort of politically opposed to him. Franco's regime didn't actually interfere with their ability to make art and to make a living. So as far as I know, that's all I can sort of report on the situation of artists under Franco.
I think it's worth mentioning that I mean, I personally, again, this is sort of a question for a different stream, but I personally would say that Franco was not a fascist because he was too reactionary to really be a fascist. And one of the more sort of pragmatic aspects of his regime was the fact that very little was outright banned. You know, you could be a sort of modernist, and if you as you wanted in the arts, you could buy like Marxist books or whatever, but you just couldn't sort of put anything into action. I don't think that was where the buck stopped. You know, as long as you didn't challenge the state literally, then you were sort of you know, you'd basically be all right, especially towards the end of the regime. So yeah, I think it's I think Franco's position, a historian, I can't remember who it was. I think it was one of the POSD ones, but it was still a very good remark. It was that Franco's ideology can only really be seriously regarded as being pro-Franco. You know, it's that sort of thing. He'd basically do whatever he could to just stick around and keep Spain how he liked it.
Cool. Okay, cool. Should we make a start on the Germans then?
Yes. The old Germans, as my grandmother used to say.
Exactly. So maybe just as a bit of a background, as we had last time, I mean, art. Is it fair to say that art wasn't really a kind of key part to the build-up of the kind of Nazi movement? So, as with the Italians, we saw the kind of those intellectual movements sort of form around fascism and art. With the Germans, that wasn't necessarily the case, unless you guys know otherwise. So, on the kind of even before Hitler was in power, art wasn't really on their radar in the same kind of way, apart from one certain way.
Well, I would say the one exception is they were very opposed to the Bauhaus, and the Bauhaus were a lightning rod for reactionaries and Nazis and conservatives, because of course the Bauhaus was a sort of progressivist, modernist center for education in fine and applied arts, and they were promulgating all sorts of sort of ultra-leftist theories like sort of homosexuality, interest in Eastern European religion, Oriental religion, dress reform, all sorts of all the liberal causes, and of course modernist art was the most obvious one. And this, of course, made them very unpopular with traditionalists. And so the Nazis and Bauhaus were sort of fighting a running battle until 1933, when Bauhaus basically dissolved itself.
So it's interesting, because I think you mentioned this last time, Panama, that the German view is very much a negative. These are the things we don't like.
Yes.
While the Italian was always positive. This is the future of art. This is how we see ourselves in the artistic landscape. So already you can see kind of like the cultural and soul differences between the two different groups, and I can imagine that again things like the Bauhaus being used as a rallying cry, to try and pull the country together, in a sort of in a similar way to people just posting decline posting on Twitter, just posting an image of something terrible and just put decline underneath it.
Left bad, basically.
Exactly. Did they specifically mention the Bauhaus as part of their kind of policies at all, or was it just kind of like a more...
Well, the regional parties absolutely loathed it. I mean, they hounded the Bauhaus into moving into different states within Germany. Okay. So I mean, they were actively persecuting the Bauhaus, and finally the Bauhaus moved in something like 1931 or 1932 to Berlin, which was the most read city of all. And then, of course, the Nazis came to power in 1933, and then the whole country was sort of was a sort of hostile territory for outright modernism.
I think. Oh, sorry.
No. You go.
Well, I think that one thing that was particularly egregious to not just the Nazis, but any sort of conservative sort of art interested people at the time was, of course, that prior to Bauhaus, anybody that wanted to be an artist would go to art school, where they would learn all the kind of fundamentals of how to make art and make sort of imagery, and then they would sort of go on to train in a traditional manner, and then they might go on to become a modernist from there. But of course, what Bauhaus was doing was they were actually teaching modernism as sort of a base principle of art, as opposed to something that happened afterwards. And I believe that, I think Alexander would know more about this, but I believe that caused a lot of controversy.
Yeah, they didn't. I don't think they did life drawing. It's very interesting that the Bauhaus kind of almost completely neglected art which featured the human figure. They were quite suspicious of that. They did some damage. One time they were inhabiting an older building, and there was a statue in it which was crudely graffitied as well, and I think eventually taken down just to protect it. So they kind of made themselves unpopular with conservatives by actually radically working against tradition and spiting tradition and kind of flaunting their progressivism. So yeah, I mean, they did teach different skills and different crafts, but they were very much to do with applied arts, and it was metalwork and ceramics and so forth. But you're right, they didn't teach the fundamentals of academic art. That's correct.
Yeah.
There is also a definite kind of anti-traditionalism streak in their teaching as well. Where again everything was to be reconsidered from the ground up again, but what I think there could be an entire kind of stream on this. I've brought up the famous circle. I don't know if you guys have seen this before. This is the Bauhaus training circle, where this is kind of how you learn to get to reach the bow in the center. I've got a nice translated version here, which is a little bit larger. But I actually took a course where you kind of explore how some of the some of the Bauhaus lessons were done, and also actually randomly Vic Reeves had an entire Bauhaus documentary, and they kind of went through some of the exercises they would do. So, for example, there was an obsession with the primary colors, blue, yellow, and red. And how they attach to certain shapes, and so you had to kind of only do a total reimagining of something only out of those shapes or something like that. It's a very, so as opposed to, I guess, traditional teaching. I mean, Panama, you mentioned around kind of like going to university or whatever and learning to do art. In the 19th century, most people would probably still either train under as like an apprentice or part of a workshop, or they would go to an academy, which isn't really like university. It's kind of
it's a specific art school.
It's more like self-motivated learning. Like if you read about if you read through Holman Hunt's biography, he talks about like his experience at the RA, and it's very much you just basically they'll kind of host a like a session where everyone's drawing from life or everyone's drawing from antique or something like that. So it's very much kind of like you have to put the effort in and you do the work, and maybe you'll kind of like you'll paint from a master or spend a bit of time with an individual person, but it's more kind of like you're having that knowledge passed down to you from someone else, as opposed to this, which is just saying, here's the kind of medium you're going to be working in. Now create something totally from new. Now, what's also interesting about this is that this is basically the what we do today. You know, again, Alex, I'm sure you know way more about this than I do, but I genuinely think that the Bauhaus training schedule is very much like the beginning of modern art training. You know, if you go to even GCSE today, you'll do stuff in clay, you'll do stuff maybe not in textiles and other, but they go through very much different areas, and it's not that approach of the handing down of knowledge as opposed to follow some other artists, or here's
so I suppose as sort of people that I presume you both sort of trained in art in some way, is the flaw of this that it's kind of technified as opposed to sort of passing down a skill, like you said, like it's sort of like the textbookification, if you like, of what it is to train as an artist.
Well, from my history, I mean, I studied art at school, and then I did a foundation course, and then I went to Goldsmiths to study art for my BA. And I mean, this is something that's quite close to the way that modern art education has been structured. So you would go through these very basic things, but you would not. Ours included life drawing as well. But this is sort of radically pared down. This is also allied quite closely to the idea that all the fine arts should ultimately be a kind of applied art, and that art would be useful, and it's a utilitarian approach. Interestingly enough, the Bauhaus model was taken up in Russia for its own art school. And I've recently reviewed a big volume of their training materials, which has been translated into English for the first time. I would suggest actually it's probably worth doing a different stream on this, because this gets quite complicated. But this is a very good representation of the modernist approach to art education.
That's a good idea. Let's park this for now, because we're way off course. But basically, Bauhaus was considered to be very bad. Now I did reference the fact that the Nazis did have a bit of an artistic background, and of course that is in the works of a certain Austrian painter. Alex, I don't know if you want to kind of talk through some of these images that you sent across.
Okay, yeah. So this is, this is just sort of some of the most common images that you'll find of Adolf Hitler's watercolors. He was watercolor painter. So basically, he did sort of train with an artist. He trained in the sort of the Biedermeier school, which is quite traditional, quite sentimental. So here, this is a good example of a Biedermeier painting by Waldmüller. So this is the sort of art that dominated Central Europe. So that would be sort of Austria, Czechoslovakia, or the Central European nations. And it's sort of it's strongly sentimental. It's sort of it's relatively realistic in its technique, but it's not realistic in its composition or its emotion. And so this is sort of very much what dominated the art of Hitler's sort of lower middle class origins.
Young arrived there.
And this extended up to the upper classes as well.
Yeah, that's a slightly haunted child. Yeah, there's definitely something like totally false about the whole thing. But it's interesting. It's interesting how he had that kind of training, growing up, because again, his ideas of the kind of perfect household or the perfect family or the perfect people. Could you not say that that's a direct relationship to this kind of school, where again it's the pastoral
maybe, but then you could say, well, how is this so different to Victorian painting in England that we looked at?
I mean, that's true to agree. Certainly for some of their kind of realist stuff. I mean, Victorian sentimentalism is a little bit different because it's very much focused on the child. So again, something like Millet's Bubbles is the classic example where I feel like this is very much the family. It's almost something pastoral about it. There's that kind of romanticism as well.
I would say that. I mean, again, I'm not familiar with this particular school, but if we take this as kind of a representation of it, then I would say that the Victorian sentimentalism never. Well, it was very difficult to get it this sort of stultified, and sort of, kind of trapped in itself, if you see what I mean. Because I love the rural. I love the traditional family. I love the regionalism. I love the pastoralism, and even this to me is kind of just too, posed and
it's a bit fake,
flat.
isn't it?
It doesn't hit the market, I don't think. Whereas a lot of the Victorian, as I said, the Victorian sort of romantic, sort of chocolate boxy sort of stuff does have a kind of life to it. Some of it sort of very, very vividly. Depending on the painter.
Yeah. So Adolf Hitler was trained. Well, he trained in this area. He was working as a watercolor painter, working on views. He was primarily interested in architectural subjects. Now, from an architectural point of view, this is actually a pretty good piece. There's a possibility he was working from a postcard. I mean, not that necessarily discredits it or anything, but it makes working a little bit easier, especially when you've got to be exact. So having a precise source would have helped him. He did work on site, and then he also did work from illustrations and postcards. And I think the handling of the architecture is quite competent. He was less good on figures, so quite understandably, he didn't pay so much attention to them. He didn't receive academic training. He while in Vienna, he did apply to the fine art school in, I think it was 1906 and 1907. He was rejected twice. And of course, well, we all know what happened afterwards. But curiously enough, if he had been accepted, he would have been working side by side with Egon Schiele.
This is what's interesting.
Expressionist guy.
Yeah, well, exactly. And what I think is interesting is that Vienna had, gone way past this form of art. With the Viennese secession, like you said. I mean, Schiele is he would be like the #1 degenerate artist, of Vienna for the next 15 years or so.
If he had been famous enough, he would have been banned by the Nazis, but he wasn't. He wasn't famous enough to be banned. He only became famous after the war.
Yeah, one thing I would say is, obviously, I think in our eyes, that, like I said, it does look relatively competent, but the quality was just so much better back in those days. So I can see why he would have been rejected, especially because of his treatment of figures, which are pretty dang bad. Because again, normally you'd submit a range of for the academies back in those days, you would have to either do a single drawing live, like in the École de Beaux-Arts, over a series of sessions, or the Royal Academy, you had to submit a series of studies, and then a painting which had been recommended by another RA member, if that makes sense. And that's in the Victorian times, though. So, yeah, I mean, this one's definitely less good.
This is very Bob Ross, don't you think?
That sums it up, I think. I mean, I do remember reading somewhere that that in the rejection letter that he got the first time round, the examiner actually said that what you really want to do is apply to an architecture school. That's where you'll have success. I mean, all of my opinions on his art are sort of secondhand because I don't have the technical training in it. But I do remember reading that his like the reason that they rejected him was largely because they felt that there wasn't really a sort of artistic, as in the personal artistic quality to it, mainly because of that lack of humanity in the drawings. You know, this idea that, you know, as you said, he can draw somewhat competently these sort of vast urban structures and streets and sort of features, but just not people. And of course, the major emphasis, correct me if I'm wrong, but the major emphasis in art at that time was on the human figure, you know, and the sort of, you know, the face.
Any time, you know, like there's very few architectural based movements. That's very interesting actually, because again, the difference between depictions of the stone and the flesh and the empathy. There's something about his nature as well, which is very very flat as well. Where again, this
is one of the rare oil paintings in it, and it shows that he really wasn't suited to oil painting. He was a competent watercolorist in terms of technique, but in terms of oil, this is quite weak. But you do actually need quite a bit of practice to get oil painting right. So.
I mean, I know that Mr. D, our illustrious our acolyte,
our mutual friend.
He really went off on these a couple months ago. No, it was a lot longer actually. But he sort of got his lines out. You know, drew you know, sort of the faults in the picture and sort of pointed out where the perspectives don't match and sort of, you know, threw them out. You know, if he could have done, if he'd had them in front of him. And I mean, I would this one he had a real bone to pick with this. Though I mean, like, just as two people that are kind of more technically aware of art than I am, if you were sort of teaching students or you were sort of running an art academy or something, how would you judge a sort of starter student that handed these in? Like, do these show any particular sort of promise? Like you said, go on, sorry.
Oh well, I would say that this is A-level standard art. It's pretty good. I mean, he's, you know, I mean, obviously the sort of, you know, slight problems with perspective and so forth, but you don't sort those out when you're 15 or 16. But this is pretty good. I mean, would be enough to get you into a small art school in the period. But of course, he's going in for the most prestigious art school in Vienna, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this is just not really up to standard.
Vienna as well. Again, we cannot underestimate like how powerful, like how magnificent. I would probably say that Vienna in was it 1910 is probably one of the most amazing. Would have been one of the most amazing places in the world to have been.
This is the height of the secession and movement.
Yeah,
and
exactly. But also the wealth and power of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is just bringing in amazing people. It's just a real happening place. You know, I think we forget how truly wonderful Vienna would have been at that time. But you know, to your point again, like he would have been a perfectly competent draftsperson in an architectural firm, or actually quite good, like architect doing his kind of plans beforehand. The problem is that he's got no breadth beyond the building. Even again, the tree here is just like it's not great. It's not natural, and I think I can imagine that's why he got that feedback. But
I think he would have been quite good as an architectural illustrator, perhaps, you know, for publication.
Exactly. It's kind of interesting. I think though, because he sort of like didn't take the advice at all. You know, he's obviously had some kind of talent and could have gone on to do something else. And what most people would have done would be say, okay, maybe I'm not going to be the next Klimt.
Well, this is the thing.
Maybe I could be, you know, a respectable person. So
I think the Austrian painter wanted to kind of he like, as you say, most people, if they say, look, your skills are with buildings and architecture, go to an architecture firm and you'll do well. But he doesn't want that. He wants to be among, the sort of Wagners of sort of German arts. He wants to be among the sort of great men and all the great traditions of that country. He doesn't just want to be an architect, an illustrator. But of course, he doesn't have the sort of talent really to make it there. So that's his problem, isn't it? And that's why he spends so long living in terrible anguish on the streets.
Mm. I think he always thought of himself as an artist, as a real artist, as a creative figure. I don't think he had it in him. I think he was at best a competent technical artist in maybe some of the sort of the applied arts. He would have done okay, but he didn't really understand his limitations.
Just on the creativity, I think that's another thing that's lacking, because again, something about the building is you're just reflecting reality at that point. Like, it's interesting you mentioned about the postcard for this, because what that means is that it would probably strip away the need for composition, the need for creating the characters and the poses, and I think fundamentally Hitler is not a creative person. Do you know what I'm saying? He's not great at generating this again, and that's the point around a technical artist as opposed to necessarily a creative one. And again, I think maybe that that probably troubled him for sure. But should we move on a little bit? Yeah. So obviously Hitler had all this background. Roland First World War. Was it almost got shot? Did he get?
He was gassed.
He was gassed.
He was in hospital at the end. Yeah.
Yes. I believe didn't he? Wasn't he sort of up for an Iron Cross but didn't get one? Or something along those lines.
He did get some sort of award for bravery as a trench runner, and it was a very dangerous position.
Yes, and I believe he was the Corporal Hitler was noted in the Army's staff book as having been the only NCO to not permit his troops to go and shake hands with the Brits during the Christmas truce. He's the only one on the whole front who wouldn't let them go and have some chocolates and some tobacco.
That's so funny. Oh dear. And should we, I guess, kind of roll forward to the Nazi Party taking power? Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, as kind of part of having control over a very powerful industrial nation, that they needed to use art in a way which kind of explained who they were, what they were looking to do, and what they were trying to achieve. So we've got some of their kind of buildings. Alex, do you want to take us through these?
Yeah. So I'll just get up my list. Okay, so this is Paul Troost. He was an early influence on the German on the German Nazi architecture boom. He died in 1935, so this was something that that was not even completed by the time he died. This was designed between 1933 and was designed and built between 33 and 37. So this is the House of German Art, built in Munich, of course, which was the heart of the Nazi movement and the heart of the way that the sort of the geographical center of the Nazi movement, which was, of course, mainly South Germany, Bavaria, and Austria. This is obviously how the Nazis wanted to present their own art, and of course it's sort of neoclassical and draws from obviously from the Roman and Greek predecessors.
Yeah, so I would describe this as like a stripped back Palladianism, basically, maybe even with like monumental elements. Like, you would never really have a row of columns this long in traditional classical art. Also, interestingly, they've kind of removed all ornamentation from it. This is sort of like I was saying with the Palladianism, but even Palladio would have the different orders of the columns. So that's the kind of
because you have Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, Composite, Tuscan. I think it goes in terms of complexity. And these are none of them.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of interesting how that's been taken away, but obviously they're kind of trying to kind of tap into the idea of Rome, and it's interesting how the Italians do that as well. We saw with the kind of the Trajan column-esque reliefs. It's kind of like a different interpretation. This is just to kind of say we are. The inheritors of Rome. We have the power, but there is a kind of a coldness to it at the same time because it's just so minimal. It's almost a minimalist.
It's also gigantic as well.
Yeah, it's overpowering. Again, the kind of stretched out pier here is like ridiculously long. Yeah. So they're telling you a lot from the kind of architectural style already.
Yeah, so this is the Reichskanzlei from Berlin. This is the Vossstrasse entrance. The bunker that you will all know about, of course, was basically in the back garden of this building. And this is, I think this was this Speer? I can't remember. Yeah, I think this was Speer. So he designed the Reichskanzlei. And that was completed. What was this? 1939. 1930. Well, this was in 1939, but I think it was actually completed a couple of years earlier. So this again is a sort of it's a combination of Central European or sort of even Haussmann style architecture. A little bit more severe, a little bit more stripped back, of course, gigantic in scale, which of course is something that is common to fascist art and National Socialist art. And then you see the guards and of course the giant eagle above. Square columns, of course, not typical of classical architecture, but quite favoured in the modernist interpretations of classicalism.
Yeah, you would sometimes have them as part of a series of other columns as well. So maybe on a corner, for example. But like you said, it's very, very rare. Interestingly, there is a vein of neoclassicism in Munich at the time. So I'm thinking of specifically, if you're familiar with the Villa-Stuck. Which is a guy called Franz von Stucke, who is
I don't think it'd be spelled like that. Literally, the Villa Stuck.
Yeah. I'll see if we can get a bigger picture. But this is in Munich at I think it's 1890, for example. And he's a symbolist, basically. Quite famous for some of his depictions of women. But there is already in Munich at the time a bit of this kind of neoclassical element. But it's very much focused on, the figure. This is much more traditional. Still, you've got things like the kind of ornamented pediments. You've got the sculptural work. He actually used concrete. The building's very famous for using concrete. But again, the columns themselves are fluted, and so it's interesting how there is this neoclassical element. There's some of the interiors as well, knocking around just before this, but it's kind of like Speer really ramps it up to this kind of, again, almost brutalist sort of level, a much bigger size. This is quite a small building, really. So yeah, it is coming out of a tradition of sorts, but and also one thing to mention again with the eagle as well, that there's a reference to the imperial eagle, but there's a dual aspect with that, because there's the German eagle and also the Holy Roman Empire as well, which obviously is because is that literally where the Third Reich comes from? It's the third empire. I
yes,
quite
it's
remember.
the third iteration of Germany, the German state. So if I'm correct, it's been a while since I've looked into it, but I think the first is it King Frederick Barbarossa?
Barbarossa, I think. Yeah.
Then the second is Frederick the Great, or the sort of German the Empire period. From I think they kind of lump all that into one. and then the third was this, the Nazi Reich.
Just on Speer a second, because he again becomes like one of the Nazis' #1 architects during this period. Produces a lot of sketches and a lot of works carried out, but he was the kind of most favored by Adolf. I don't know if you have anything else to say about Speer.
Well, he was essential in Hitler's plans for Berlin, which was Germania. Berlin would be sort of reshaped and redesigned as an imperial center for the Reich under basically the joint architectural leadership of Hitler and Speer, and they spent a lot of time together. They worked on some very elaborate models. The centerpiece was going to be the Volkshalle, the People's Hall, which was going to be so huge that it was that you would actually get something like you'd get condensation in forming clouds inside this building because it was so large.
Yeah.
You can see the insane scale.
Look at the people.
I mean, I have to say, I loathe
it's not
Nazi
good.
architecture. It's horrendous. It's so empty and hollow and sort of almost it's just, it doesn't mean anything other than just we can build a massive bloody dome. You know, it doesn't even have the kind of Chad Trajan column-esque, like, you know, I'm just going to build a massive column here. It's so empty, you know. I mean, literally as well as a massive empty dome, you know.
There is an irony as well, where again, one of the kind of key emphasis on the kind of classical style of architecture is on proportion and scale. So, for example, with columns, there are very specific rules you need to do about width versus height, and none of those are followed. I can tell you already; those are too long.
They're far too narrow, far too tall. Yeah.
So you're saying that this building wouldn't stand up?
Oh no, it would, but it breaks the rules of proportion.
Right. Okay.
Vitruvius sort of laid out what those kind of classical rules were at the time.
He
basically says,
stylistically.
Yeah, if you're making an ionic column and you want it to be X, I think it's like 10 diameters tall is like the ratio or something like that.
And it has to taper as well slightly.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So each of the different orders has a specific height. But again, that's why you end up with this kind of slightly uncanny valley feeling about it, where it does sort of feel like
it looks like the grill of a BMW, doesn't it?
It does a bit. I mean, it almost looks stunted just because you've got that like big sort of very squat dome. It almost looks like a sort of dwarf thing, you know. It's compressed almost. And I mean, I think I remember reading that this was not a possible thing to build because the ground underneath it wouldn't support it.
This was really insanely ambitious. Basically, the only thing that was done in Germania was they started with the Reichskanzlei, and they saw the Air Force building, which is still on Leipziger Strasse. I used to live in Berlin, so I used to walk past these all the time. The ones that are remaining, and they're not many. The only thing that Speer built, apart from the Reichskanzlei, was there was a big concrete block which was built to measure the density of the soil and the sink factor of the building of the terrain, and that was built, but that was just basically a big block of concrete, and that still survives.
Interesting. Yeah.
The flak term, I have to say, the gunnery towers, the flak term.
Yes.
There's three of them. There were three of them in Berlin. There was one in Vienna as well, which is still there.
I've been to it. Yeah, it's an aquarium. It's awesome. On a second, we've got to show this. What they're called? Flak towers.
Flak term.
That's it.
4 flak towers. Berlin, or Vienna. Yeah, the Vienna one is open.
Yeah, that's like this ironically is the best Nazi architecture in my opinion.
It is quite something, and those are the sort of gunnery roundels. So you'd fit anti-aircraft guns in those sort of rounded positions on the corners.
So it was almost like an invisible fortress around the. Well, okay, not
But the
not
problem,
that invisible.
the problem was it was too visible. What happened
Yeah.
was when the Allies were going over Germany, what they would see is they'd see these three great towers firing flak at them. So because they're like permanently illuminated, and they would triangulate it, and they would work out that even if there was a blackout, all they had to do is to put the bombs in between the three towers, and they would be in the center of Berlin.
There you go. You
Yeah,
think somebody would have noticed that?
Yeah, so the two of the flak turret in Berlin have been destroyed. One of them still partially survives, and you can go into it, but only with a guide. And I tell you, it is one of the most eerie places you can imagine.
Isn't it the Zoo flak tower? Didn't they literally build it like in the Berlin Zoo?
Yeah, there's the Tiergarten, and then there was another one. There's one south. I can't remember what that one was called. And then there's Humboldt Park. That is the one that was partially demolished. The Allies made a point of destroying the one in the Tiergarten. They set up all these bombs, and they fired off all the bombs, and the building stayed up. And then Germans came out overnight and said, "Built by Germans."
There you go.
Yeah,
it must have been,
And I tell you, it's one of the most sobering experiences of your life. If you go into the Humboldtine Flakturm, which is basically a mound now, it's partially covered, and you go into it and you see the concrete stairwell, and you hear about this is where all the little German teenagers, the nurses, this is where they went to jump off to commit suicide.
Oh my goodness, very sad.
Rather than face the Soviet soldiers.
Can't blame them. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that haunting.
Yeah, sorry, that's rather. Yeah. This should be a light-hearted stream about Nazism.
The Art of Darkness. Remember, Pharaoh, the Art of Darkness.
This is all your fault.
This is a cozy Saturday stream.
I'm afraid not.
So here we are in the sort of the Nazi cult death regime's inner sanctum. This is the courtyard.
This is a bit better. This looks again, the columns are annoyingly out of proportion, but there's some good sculptural work there. So
yeah. So I think are we gonna mention Arno Brecker later on? I think we are.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it was on my list. But anyway, so this is the Marble Hall. Fantastic, but also insane. It's made with red marble. This red marble was, after the war, some of it was used for the Mohrenstrasse U-Bahnhof station. So if you go there and you see the red marble on the walls, that actually came from the Reichskanzlei. The Soviets also used it to build a war memorial to the Soviet dead in Berlin.
Interesting.
Oh.
Again, it's got that kind of monumental feel, like I was talking about with some of the Italian fascist interiors, but obviously it's more classically styled. In my opinion, again, I think the Italian interiors are superior, but again, the proportions just don't feel quite right here with the kind of size of everything, and they're having to put these really awkward candelabras halfway down the room, but I'm sure it would be impressive.
I just feel bad for people that have sort of. Well, I mean, yeah, or just the fact that somebody says you're a young sort of aide working here, and they say, "Oh, can you take this message upstairs?" You got to then trek all the way through this. You'd hate this hallway after a while, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I think they should put in one of those travelators, like an airport.
Yeah. give all the staff a bicycle.
Yeah, so this is a painting by Anselm Kiefer. So this was painted in So this is called To the Unknown Painter. This is a painting made of oil, acrylic, latex, emulsion, shellac, and lots of straw. Painted by Anselm Kiefer in 1983. And this is based on I think it's the Reichskanzlei. There was another building. Yeah, there was a monument, I think, to the unknown soldier built in Berlin. I did look for it on the internet to try and get an image, but I couldn't think of whatever the term was specifically. But this is a painting made by a German artist. Interestingly enough, he's a German Jew, and this is one of his very large paintings. He became part of the 1980s revival of the near expressionists, and you'll see right in the center there is an artist's palette on a stake or a stave or a stick or something, and so he's turned one of Hitler's giant buildings to the German state. He's turned its ruined form into a monument to the lost artist.
It also kind of is reminiscent of like a microphone stand or something, so you kind of speaking out into the void there. But it's very
apocalyptic void. Yeah.
Cozy stream.
cozy.
Yeah. So this is Germania.
Oh, yeah.
This is the Volk. This is an architectural model. I'm not sure if the original architectural model still survives, but there is an architectural model in Berlin of what Hitler was going to do. They were going to do all sorts of things. They were going to move the Brandenburg Tower, the Brandenburg Arch, but that's not there.
The gates.
This is going to be a new one. They also moved the famous column with the gilded figure on the top. They actually moved it, and they expanded it. They added an extra They added an extra extension in the column to make it taller. But anyway, so Germany was going to be basically well, yes, could be symbolic. So they were going to basically realign a large boulevard down in the center of Berlin to sort of make it grander, more imperial, and so forth.
There's something reminiscent of this, of the I don't know if it's called the Boulevard or whatever, but between the Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square.
Oh, the Mall.
The Mall, yes, there you go.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's again trying to get some of that kind of British imperial, like you said, style, kind of grandeur,
or perhaps that French. Is it the main sort of avenue?
There's the Champs-Élysées acts as a sort of roundel.
Yeah. Also, Alexander, was this going to be so that they were going to build a whole new capital outside of Berlin?
They were going to rebuild the main civic buildings, and they were going to realign it and make it more ordered and more regular.
Berlin.
Yeah, so this was Berlin. Yeah. They were going to rename Berlin Germania.
Yeah.
To get rid of, obviously, Berlin had lots of old connotations of not only the Hohenzollern dynasty, which actually resided slightly outside in Potsdam, where they had all the palaces.
That's it.
Yeah. So they were going to sort of realign the main thoroughfares. They were going to rebuild the main civic buildings. They were going to reposition some buildings and monuments, but they weren't going to entirely rebuild the city. No, that would have been insane.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's not like they had vanity projects at all. It's not like the Nazis.
Yeah, and of course, virtually none of this was done because of the intervention of a certain conflict.
Yeah, there was something happened, didn't it?
What's interesting is obviously the Italians have something similar to this with their with the EUR center that we saw as well, but they managed to create so much more than the Germans did. So again, I think that's interesting, just in terms of like architectural will. They managed to very very basically achieve their model, apart from like one or two buildings, basically. So yeah.
So this is the Führerbau. This is the Hitler's. This is the sort of the Hitler's office, the party office in Munich.
And that's Hitler's Audi outside there.
Yes, and interestingly enough, this intersects because this was where a lot of the looted art was stored. It was bombed during the war, and a lot of the art that is now missing was looted by German civilians from the bombed Führerbau in 1944 or 45.
Interesting. So it was like people just sort of swarmed in and made off with it.
Yeah, and this was art that was looted from around occupied Europe.
Right.
Just commenting on the architecture a second. Again, it's just a really like a thin gruel of classicism here.
It's very severe, isn't it?
Yeah,
It
exactly.
lacks all the ornamentation.
I wouldn't look twice at it.
But then, like, if you look at Palladianism, which again really strips back the neoclassical element, there is a kind of a real harmony and a real beauty in the simplicity. While again they've got all of these windows going all the way across, it sort of reminds me of like a factory or something like that, where they just need to have all of these lights. And again, this is a monstrosity here.
Yeah,
having a square frame, but then a circular window is. Whoever did that should be fired. And they probably were. They were probably literally fired at.
Probably worse, yeah.
I think that is the last one of yours, Alex. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to this section.
Not offhand. I mean, I think obviously we'll get to talk about the looting later on, but I think that covers Nazi architecture.
Okay, cool. Well, I've got a few things I wanted to touch on from my side. One was I was trying really hard to find a Nazi artist that was actually good, because again, again, I don't want to slam them too much. I was trying to be as value free as possible, but there was a lot of low tier art being kind of brought to the fore by Hitler. Hitler only had 2 state-mandated artists, and interestingly, one of them is the kind of lesser-known Joseph Thorak, who you can see here. He is a fellow Austrian. His father was ceramicist, and he trained in Vienna, unlike Hitler, and then eventually moved to Berlin. Later on, after a couple of commissions, he got noticed by Hitler, and Hitler personally said that he really liked his work, and from that he got a ton of commissions. But most of his work's sculptural, but he has this kind of very bold. Sort of there's an element of modernism to it as well. There's an element of Soviet realism, the kind of the perfect forms of humanity. But he's quite famous. That there's like a couple of horses that he did, which are quite famous. But his work just sort of pops up all over the place. Again, a lot of it has been kind of abused. This is kind of like a memorial at the same time. But there is a kind of a monumental strength to his work. Again, just similar to the kind of architecture. The size of the work is very, very large in comparison. But he also has these kind of like allegorical works at the same time. So I think a very much more nuanced artist.
Have you seen the video of a studio, of a Nazi sculpture studio?
No.
It's available on YouTube. It's very interesting. It's these super, super, super monumental works. I mean, it's the sort of thing that a Central Asian despot would build in gold now.
It is very much like that. I think I've got something for scale. Okay, no, that's one of the first ones, but I think a person was literally like that tall, like up to the shin basically.
So is that the pavilion? Is that the French pavilion?
Yes, I think so. Yes, for the international
exposition.
International expedition.
What was that? 36? No, sorry, 37. No, it's 37, of course, because that was where Guernica was shown. 37. Yeah.
Yeah,
where the Nazis and the Soviets sort of faced off at each other across an avenue.
Yeah, exactly.
I do just want to sort of pick up again this problem that a lot of this is very almost sort of sad. In its sort of like, we are Germany. Look how strong we are because we've built a load of statues of strong people. It's too, like, perhaps the reason that Trajan's column is so remembered is because it's it was built right after he had just gone and done incredible things, or the fact that statue of Caesar, was after the conquest, or the sort of rise to the imperium. It doesn't matter how many. It's kind of like with you mentioned what the sort of Asian dictators like to do now, where they build these enormous sort of gold statues of this or that. It's sort of like it unless there's a reason for it, unless you've recently done something that warrants a monument to it, then it's sort of hollow, isn't it? It's just sort of saying that you're something when you just aren't.
Yeah, one thing I would say is that Thorax is a little bit of a more complicated character. He obviously, was a card-carrying Nazi, but his first wife was Jewish, and he helped get her out of the country to England. And I get the impression he really wasn't that much of a Nazi. He just happened to be liked by Hitler, and then his kind of fame blew up after that point. So I don't think he's not really like Speer in my mind. He's not like a fanatic. He's just sort of like he sort of rides off the back of just being liked by Hitler.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of talk about Gita Sereni wrote a book about interviewing Speer in later life, and she thought that he was basically a careerist, and that although, I mean, he wanted to be an architect. Obviously, he liked the fame, he used the position, he liked the close contact with Hitler, but he was essentially a careerist. So I'm not sure that there are not many artists who were sort of devoutly ideological or political, but you do find that they put their shoulder to the wheel when it suits them and when it advantages them. But I'm not sure how ideologically literate or committed they were.
But I think in contrast to the Italian artists, there were a lot more who placed Italian fascism at the center of their works, if that makes sense. It's weird.
Nazism, you mean?
No, I'm saying so for some, like last time, when you were looking at the Italian fascist artists, that they, I would say, were much more bought into the ideology of fascism, and it flow through the work, as opposed to these kind of, like you said, more cynical careerists. I get the impression for some of the work. This piece itself is called Work. You've got this kind of Sisyphean ascendancy of a boulder and the kind of the men carrying it. So again, it's not necessarily like a celebration of something achieved, but more kind of just like man's struggle against life. There's something, maybe Nietzschean about it, where it's again, it's just like the power needed to move life and to move stone itself. And again, this is absolutely massive. This is absolutely huge, huge in size. I just wanted to kind of finish off on one of his more reflective pieces, which is Paris and the Golden Apple. And I've got a couple of views here, but you can the piece is actually laid out in a very specific way, where you have kind of Paris at the back here, leaning on a stick with the apple in his hand, and he's deciding which goddess to choose as the most beautiful. But again, I thought for what's interesting about Thorak is that I feel like his work is quite modern. It is quite edgy in some ways. Again, it's really emphasizing the kind of nude, but not necessarily in a classical way. So some of the male physique potentially, but again, something like the middle form here, as we'll see later, I would say that this could have sat inside some of the kind of degenerate art exhibitions relatively easily. So the line between degenerate and approved art seems, in my mind, to be absolutely arbitrary, and it just depends whatever Hitler didn't like, basically.
Yes and no. I mean, we'll get to Emil Nolde when we get to him, but it's interesting to note that obviously naturism was a big thing. It was before. before the First World War and then after the Second World War, and of course this relates to the sort of the culture of I can't remember what it's called, that naturopathy. I think it's called curing through nature, which was very big in Europe in the sort of from the sort of 1900 period onwards, and you'll find that there's interesting parallels and conflicts between the way socialist realism demanded that artists work and the way that the National Socialists worked. There's quite a lot of overlap. The Germans have slightly more nudity than the Soviets, and the one difference is, of course, that there's a strong racial element to the German art that there isn't to the Soviet art. But curiously enough, that changes in the late Stalinist period. There's much more of a Russification. There's a drive for Russification following the Great Patriotic War. Stalin wanted to sort of to downplay the minority peoples and to emphasize the importance of ethnic Russia to the success of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War.
Right, so that's basically Thorak. But anyway, he's definitely worth more investigation. Please check him out. I think definitely underrated. Now, just in terms of other stuff I've got here, I wanted to kind of bring up the Olympic Games. So obviously, 1936, the Olympic Games are held in Berlin, and I thought it was an interesting time to look at, just because in terms of like Germany showing to the world what they're about. I mean, with the English Games, we put Fatboy Slim in a bus.
Yeah. And celebrated the NHS, I think.
And celebrated the NHS.
Yeah,
which is about right. So
all hail our NHS.
Yeah, exactly. But this is obviously the kind of the stadium that's built. Again, it's got that kind of super stark like quasi-classicalism that we've seen in the architecture. I've got a kind of a zoomed out photo across here, but again,
but it's also unashamedly modernist. I mean, the lack of ornamentation shouts modernism, and so this shows you the way that both the fascists and the Nazis would use classical illusions, but they were very much dealing with modern tools, modern materials, modern forms.
Yeah, in some ways, I think that the Italian fascists were more respectful of classical sensibilities than the Nazis did, basically.
Yeah.
Like, even though they were not really traditionalists, and like again, the Nazis are the one that meant to be the kind of return to the past traditionalists. But
yeah, we should also mention that in terms of Nazi buildings, this building is still there.
Yeah.
And also Tempelhof Airport is still there. So those are two major Nazi buildings that are Nazi era buildings that are still in existence and still in use. Oh, sorry. So Tempelhof has recently closed, but the building is still there.
This was the whatever the lighting of the flame ceremony that starts. I mean, one thing I would say again is that the building was created for these like large moments. Again, you can see the kind of like the mass demonstrations of of people. You can see here like hundreds of people. It's just heads. You'll only see this in like a North Korea like military drive or whatever, but it's like in terms of like the creation of the space, there was a definite point of the monumentalism, and that is to store everyone inside it for moments like these. And again, this is a pretty dramatic shot.
The mass rally.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting how the building is kind of like quite utilitarian at the same time. It's the function as overrides any kind of symbolic meaning behind it.
And also remember that the Nuremberg rallies were essentially they were designed to look good on film and in photographs. So you had those amazing light shows. So you had the columns of light firing up into the air, and this was of course tailor-made for photography and film. Leading filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. Well, maybe we'll talk about the position of women in Nazi art, but she was a prominent German Nazi creator who was also a woman.
Do you want to talk about that? Well, we'll talk about Let's just do this Olympic stuff for just 2 seconds, and then we can chat about it. I've also got just a couple of posters. Again, you can see kind of like allusions to the kind of Roman past era. You know, obviously the quadrilla is the famous chariot race that would go around the various circuses of Rome. But also, you again, this racial element keeps coming through, where again you've got this kind of golden god, this kind of perfect form of humanity at the same time. So it's kind of trying to lean on classical ideas a little bit, but then also kind of turbocharge them. And
that's also on the Brandenburg Gate.
Yes, of course, yeah. This is kind of like a poster from the Olympic Games at 36.
I'm getting a strong D vibe from this. I don't know why.
This is very much, yeah, exactly.
I just love that all the memes of the current era seem to have been, viewed in the past. This is literally the sort of Chad meme. Just Chad being a Chad. It's just, I don't know. It's just the concepts are always the same, aren't they?
The idealized man. I think this is a little bit different. Where you've got
very D-esque, this one.
I mean, they do look like they're just in their pants, don't they?
In their underwear, yeah.
This is the true homofash. Yeah.
The boy brigade. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've got this again, the dark eagle on the back.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the Olympics. One last thing for me was just depictions of Hitler himself. We talked about this in the Art and Politics stream, which you should definitely check out. But they really try and big up what Hitler looks like, and they've sort of superimposed all of these kind of loving fans behind him. And again, the front image, Hitler depicted as this kind of noble jousting knight, is just literally laughable in my opinion.
They staged parades, didn't they, of Germanic figures from Germanic history, sort of dressed up in sort of costumes and so on.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I personally just again.
Oh dear.
Me Mussolini simping again, but again, Mussolini just looks better when he's delivering, and so the artistic depictions of him are always sort of true to form. When it's a gigantic Mussolini face in the sky with his chin up, you can sort of believe that.
Yeah.
Well, again, there's this unbelievable unbelievable depiction of Hitler, but
I do think that the thing with Mussolini is that he went the whole hog. He never hesitated to just absolutely just take whatever propaganda angle he wanted, and just sort of storm forward with it. As you say, it is kind of still ridiculous to us, but it sort of works. Whereas with Hitler, I get the sense that even he would have found this a bit ridiculous. This picture. In like, armor on horse, shining armor.
This is actual LARPing right here.
Yeah, this is LARPing, isn't it? And look at that ridiculous. Go on, sorry.
Sorry, did you know? He had there's a whole book of photographs of him taken, I think, mainly in Bavaria, where he was sort of sitting with children, and then there was one where he was feeding a deer and something like that. He was wearing lederhosen and so forth, and I think he was never quite sure how to project his image as sort of friend of the people, like good with children. Of course, he was worried about, he didn't want to be seen with, he wanted to be unmarried, so he would be appeal to the sort of the German women and so forth. Yeah,
which, funnily enough, did work. There's the very famous stories of all the women hurling themselves at the gravel he just walked over and eating it. I think maybe Mr. D has a point when he talks about women. I don't know, but just that sort of thing. It did seem to work for him, despite the fact that you'd hardly say he was statuesque or sort of traditionally attractive.
Here's Hitler stealing a child.
Yeah. You.
but it's interesting again, that depiction of like you're saying, like Hitler wanted to be seen as child friendly or whatever, and this is just like a politician today going around kissing babies, isn't it? So, although does this not literally translate as like children? Who's the daddy? Who's the father?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do we want to talk about that woman artist a second? I haven't got anything of hers, but I can bring it up quickly if you tell me who it is.
Oh, we got Leni Riefenstahl, who did Triumph of the Will, and oh god, well, she did two famous films. One of them was of the Nuremberg rallies, and then the other one was of the Olympics. So, and this was, and she had a direct line to Goebbels and to Hitler. She was very successful documentary maker from the Nazi period, and she went on to be a respected documentary maker afterwards as well. So her career survived working with the Nazis. And of course, I mean, this is a huge propaganda effort, and so this was her filming it. She was actually very attractive as well, which I think probably helped her.
Mm-hmm.
And so she later went on to make some very interesting anthropological.
It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time, isn't it? Trump. Yeah.
Yeah.
Literally, what's that guy who says that.
Is this Godwin's law or something?
Yeah, we need to have like Panama's law, which is like if you talk about the Nazis for long enough, a picture of Trump will appear at some point, basically.
And that's the end of the argument. Once Trump appears.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she went on to make a documentary about the Nubians, the African tribe, which was sort of to do with the sort of the primal will and the ancient history and the sort of the ties between blood and soil for Africans. So that was quite an interesting turn for her. She did that in the 1960s, I think.
What I would say is that, like, maybe if I was to be generous, I think some of the most successful Nazi art is probably on the film and cinematographic style, isn't it? I mean, this is a great. I love the shots here. These are very aesthetic. Or again, like the heads going out into the distance and stuff. That's this was partly designed with the idea of the film in mind. So you had the Nuremberg rallies, and then you had the spectacle of the Olympics, and this was designed. It was very carefully choreographed to make great photographs and to make great films, which of course would be distributed internationally and show the cohesion and the might and the discipline of Nazi Germany. There you go. It's on behind the scenes. So again, it's interesting how they sort of tapped into a kind of a new medium or whatever, and was kind of using that very, very effectively. Was there another one you mentioned as well? Sorry.
Well, just basically with the situation with women in Nazi art as opposed to Soviet women is a little bit misunderstood. There is this idea that women were only supposed to be wives and homemakers and mothers. This was not entirely true. Some women did become significant artists, but they were discouraged. They were encouraged by the Soviets to become creative figures, to be art workers, as it were. but this is less common in Germany, although I'll read you a little paragraph about an artist I reviewed. So no less curious is the life of Stephanie Hollenstein, 1886 to 1944. She was born into a farming family and studied art in Munich. During the Great War, she underwent medical training. Cutting her hair short, she joined the medical corps of the Austro-Hungarian Empire army and was an orderly and went into the theatre of war. Her deception was exposed after 2 months and she was cashiered, but the subsequent publicity of her exploit led to her being hired as a war artist. She was on the front line a number of times and was awarded the Karl Troop Cross. After the war, she worked as a landscape painter, living with her female partner. She became a member of the band Austrian branch of the Nazi Party before the Anschluss. And she was briefly chairperson of the Aryanized Vereinigung Bildender Künstlerinnen de Reichsgau de Ostmark, which is the Association of Women Artists of the Reichsgau of Austria. She defended some fellow members of the charge of artistic degeneracy. Her own work was expressionist in style, thus not entirely conforming to National Socialist artistic principles. Shortly after her resignation from this period, from this position, she died of a heart attack. So there's the name of a prominent, significant artist in Germany, well, a painter in Germany, Austria, who was actually a woman, a lesbian, and a cross-dresser. So it's not quite all that it seems.
Yeah, there's a definite let's just say that there's a lot of inconsistencies coming in my mind as you can do a bit of analysis, where again it seems like these guys have very strict rules as like what's possible and what's not, but even just beyond the surface it's just not true. But maybe that's a good segue into the dual exhibitions. So I think it's around 1937.
Yes, 1937.
Hitler wanted to come up with an exhibition on the best of German art, and Goebbels, being the little cheeky propagandist genius that he is, evil genius that he is, suggested creating, why don't we create something totally different? Everyone's seen the best of German art, but what about the worst of art? And so they created this kind of degenerate art exhibition. Here's another little picture. Obviously, Kunst is art. I quite like this because it's Kunst in the quote and then this quite bold modernist piece on the front. But it's sort of, again, if we think about exhibitions, obviously we looked at Mussolini's history of the fascist movement. I sort of love the font here. Again, it's sort of kind of jaunty. If you see many
going
other
into a theme park, isn't it, or an aquarium?
a lot of German fonts are very Gothic in nature. I wonder if this is a bit of a piss take though. You can see on the Kunst across here.
Yeah, like a child did it.
Yeah, I think it's almost like a Picasso.
It's got to be unbalanced because, of course, included in the exhibition, I don't want to preempt you, but there will be art by children and by mental patients.
There you go. This is more like the font, the standard font. It's kind of like an adaptation of like a Gothic type set. So, but I sort of love this font. I think someone needs to make the degenerate art font.
You'll notice that the word for guide is also the same. So it's the same for Hitler. It's Führer. Führer means guide. It's either a person or a guidebook.
Interesting.
Ausstellung for its exhibition guide.
I do. I mean, I think maybe Pharaoh, for like a sort of one-off stream, you should have all your like font for the video sort of captions and the the thumbnail in this font.
Yeah, you can probably recreate it. You need to invent some additional characters, though, I think. But I will find out who made that font, basically, because it's pretty cool. Good. Here we go. Here's Goebbels, looking very much like David Bowie. I felt in this picture.
He modelled himself on the thin white duke.
The thin white duke, exactly.
Well, I mean, I know this is a bit random, but I mean, Bowie did have some accusations that he was,
Yes,
you know,
he did.
Yes,
yeah, but falling a bit this way.
And do you know the paintings?
I don't, but so
Paintings are by Emil Nolde. Emil Nolde, famous German expressionist, and he was a very early supporter of the Nazis. So he was actually a committed Nazi, and I'm not sure when he became a party member, but he was a committed Nazi. He was a supporter of the Nazis, and yet, of course, his art style was expressionist, which was deemed by many of the Nazis to be degenerate. Now, some of the Nazis thought, well, actually, this expressionism stuff is actually quite good because it's very Nordic, it's very northern, it's very tied to the soil, it's very direct and primitive, and it's to do with the basic urges of the essential urges of man. So this is actually something we can tap into. But Hitler and his sort of Biedermeier taste said, no, this is degenerate. Whereas actually some of the leading Nazis did actually quite like it and were quite sympathetic towards expressionism. And Emil Nolde was actually prevented from painting by the Nazis because he was classed as degenerate. So he had to paint in watercolor, because if you painted in oil paint, people could come into his house and smell the paint, but with watercolor they couldn't.
Yeah.
That's an interesting and very sad story there. Again, this is what I'm saying about there is just this weird inconsistency. It's just like whatever Hitler just didn't like on that day, that's what gets counted as degenerate art. So
it's also this weird sort of thing where they are like, you sort of got high-ranking Nazis going to see that. Like, I presume they aren't just walking around it going, "Yeah, this is all terrible. This is bad. This is really bad." You know, like I presume there is some artistic appreciation taking place here, since they've gone to all this effort to open it up to the public and to the world.
Well, apparently there's lots of kind of banners around just like slagging stuff off. I don't know if you've got some other example.
So is it sort of like open mockery? Are people meant to
So the texts were sort of mocking this, and they were hanging pictures disadvantageously. They were putting art by children next to art by professional artists. They were including the art of the mentally ill. So it was basically saying, oh, there's no difference between these so-called modern masters and people who are crazy and people who are infantile, or children.
Now, I'm not saying that PJW is a Nazi, but I am saying he does exactly the same thing as this with some of his modern art streams. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I mean, the thing is, he said nothing of intellectual value about any art. Really, has he?
It's interesting, but it's a similar approach where it's again of like, here is something that I don't like. Here's something a child has done. Therefore, it is the same.
I don't cut this out of context. To be fair to the Nazis, the artists they were criticizing did actually draw inspiration from children's art. So the expressionists did say specifically, we can see something true and untutored and something raw in the art of children. So that's why their artists sometimes, you have these very strong colors, it's non-naturalistic, you have simple forms and so forth. So they were actually looking at the art of children when they made their own art. Of course, their own art is quite sophisticated. There's other things going on there as well, but they did actually look at the art of the mentally ill, especially for the surrealists did this, and the art of children, which is what the expressionists did.
In terms of other artists that were banned, we've got like Otto Dix. There's quite a long list. I'm just trying to remember some of the others off the top of my head.
Well, you got the Neue Sachlichkeit, so you got the Otto Dix. You've got Gross, the political artists like Gross, who we've already looked at.
Exactly. Basically,
expressionists.
All of Weimar political artists we looked at basically got
all the Bauhaus artists, so all abstract artists. So you got Kandinsky as well.
You
had sort of, so basically when we're talking about the books that were burned, interestingly enough, the book burning was not done by the Nazis per se. I think it was actually done by the Students' Union.
Yeah,
that's the first one. Yeah,
it's always the students, isn't it, for the book burning?
So the art, sort of art, the books that they burnt were on subjects such as the so-called Jewish sciences of psychoanalysis and sexology and Einsteinian physics. It was also pacifism. It was anti-German. It was Marxists and so forth. And this carried over into the arts as well. So some of the artists are just basically Marxist artists. They're socialist artists. So that automatically is classed as degenerate. Plus, you've got the surrealists as well.
It's kind of based. I don't know. Almost.
Here we go. Is Hitler? Look at he's not impressed.
I don't know
what,
I'm not sure. What is the art? That might actually be.
Is this the German one? Do you think?
Well, there you are. You see, you can't tell. You can't tell if this is the new German art or if this is degenerate.
Well, the thing is, I don't honestly believe that people would have just gone and sort of like laughed, and been like, "Haha, this is bad." I mean, they're like, especially given that all the high-ranking Nazis, including Hitler himself, went there. There's something a little bit more than that happening.
But there was a claim that the Entartete Kunst, the degenerate art, got a lot more visitors. And some people think that this was admirers of modernist art going and taking a look at art that they couldn't see in the walls.
Well, it must have been.
Because it'd been taken from the walls of the museums and was no longer able to be shown in museums. And this was one of the few places where they could see it.
But
That'd be hilarious, though.
But this is the thing. I mean, it seems too like opening a big gallery for this art and allowing people to see it almost seems kind of too liberal, to be like a sort of mockery ploy. Like, of course, there's going to be tons of people that are actual fans of it going to see it.
Just going back to that kind of the thin line between degenerate and approved. Again, you got something like the sculpture across here, which is, this like modernist sculpture of a woman.
That's Leibrucker or Lembrucker, yeah.
But if I just go back quickly to, where's my ones? Sorry. Some of my thorax stuff. Is it really that far away from some of his women? So there's a really arbitrary line in my mind about what ended up in this exhibition, basically, and it's just basically like, here are artists that we just don't like, which is in some way it's kind of clever,
Well,
like,
you'll remember Edward Munch, who painted the Scream, who came up in our symbolist discussion.
Yes.
He was classed as a degenerate artist, and his work, I think, I'm not sure if it was included in this show, but it was certainly confiscated from museums. But there were Nazi people who said, no, this guy is a genuine Nordic hero, and we should be championing him.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing that conflict. I think in this link you sent across, we've got some actual pictures of some of the works as well. I don't know if there's anything specifically you wanted to.
No, I mean, this is basically you click on whatever you want, because this is I think these are some of the works that were actually included in the exhibition.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Emil Nolde. So very strong colours, religious themes, and so forth. Kandinsky, of course, abstract work completely banned. Surrealists banned. Dadaists banned, of course. You remember I quoted the Hitler speech at the opening of the German art show, which he was saying he named the Dadaists and the Surrealists as no, not the Surrealists, but the Dadaists specifically as absurd and dangerous. So this is the expressionist work. Paul Klee, who went into exile. He was basically in Switzerland. His art was taken from museums.
See, this is pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just a question of some art is just basically a little bit more simplified and a little bit cruder.
Yeah, I heard that Schritter's got banned as well.
Yes, I have to talk about Max Beckmann. Max Beckmann was a leading expressionist Neue Sachlichkeit artist. Who was living in Amsterdam at the time, and his art was classed as degenerate. A lot of his work was withdrawn from museums, and I think we'll talk about what happened to that in a second. But he was actually permitted to carry on making art and selling art because his dealer, I think, was also involved in the looting program, in the plundering program. So that's a little bit iffy.
Yeah, again, like the rules just get constantly bent for if you just know the right people, basically.
Yes.
But okay, should we talk about looting?
Yes.
Last 15 minutes. Who'd like to start?
Well, I'll give you an overview. Basically, as soon as they moved in. Oh, so this is my article in the Critic, which is where I'm discussing two books. One of which covers one of the leading artists, leading looters. So if you can go to that will tell you all about these two books. So it's the second book. This is all about Bruno Losa, who was an art dealer who was basically Goering's man in Paris. Now, I think Panama's going to talk about Goering, so I won't talk about Goering. But basically, there was actually a pecking order for art that was plundered. Art was to be plundered from all the occupied territories in Europe, and some of it, well, it was going to be divided, and it was going to be offered up in this order. Yes, so Hitler would get first choice, then Goering, then Rosenberg's ideological school. So Rosenberg was the head thinker of Nazism, as it was, and he was sort of running ideological training camps and so forth. Then the German museums. Then it became the property of the state, and then it was generally sold, and it was sold by certain dealers who had strong ties in Switzerland. So a lot of the work in the Degenerate art show was actually moved to Switzerland through diplomatic bags, so they didn't have to declare it.
No.
And it was auctioned in Switzerland.
Crazy.
All of the German museums had their holdings of Degenerate art removed. They were confiscated by the state, and they were sold privately or they were sold by auction. It's not true to say that there was a big destruction of modernist art by the Nazis. What they tended to do is they tended to sell it. They didn't care about it. It wasn't particularly dangerous. They just wanted to get rid of it. If they could make some money from it, that was good. But they weren't really into burning it per se. So there were stories about them burning certain pictures, but this turned out not to be true. A lot of the work was actually just, if they couldn't sell it, basically people would nick it and take it home.
It seems, I wonder how much of the Degenerate art exhibition is just like a massive grift operation to basically pull out loads of art from existing collections and then liquidate it for cash, for capital. Because surely you would realize, it's like, oh look, all of this art, we can, it's a 2-for-1. Get rid of some low tier art in their minds, and then get tons and tons of cash. I do wonder how much of a driving force that was, because again, if you really cared about it, you would just burn it. Do you know what I'm saying? If you
I mean, it was not a strong ideological position of this art must be eradicated because it's dangerous. It's a question of what can we make of it? We don't want it cluttering up the museums. It's not real art. It's just rubbish. It's just throw it away. Just give it away. Yeah. If someone's going to pay for it, we'll give it away. And then of course they're also extracting the great art of the museums, the great art from private collectors, especially Jewish collectors, and that art is also going into the Nazi plunder system. So some of it's going to go to the museums, some of it's going to go to the top brass of the Nazis. What's left is going to be sold on the private market using some rather dodgy dealers who've got inside tracks. And theoretically, Goering and Hitler were supposed to be paying for their paintings that were plundered, but they never actually paid.
Of course. Random question. I was thinking this the other day. What would you say are the kind of the most famous / most beautiful paintings that were plundered?
Oh well, I think they didn't they actually get the Ghent altarpiece, the Van Eyck?
Yes,
I think they did. They got a whole bunch of Raphaels. They got Titians. I can't think off the top of my head, but they've got some amazing pictures. The Louvre had been evacuated, but they did get some.
I also think that there was those particular ones you mentioned were looted by the actual Fallschirmjäger Panzer Division Hermann Göring, as it was called. He actually had a division of SS troops named after him, and he basically used them to loot art and other fine things from around Europe. There's a picture of them I saw when I was doing some research, stood in front of I think it's the Palazzo Venezia.
He went to Venice, didn't he? Yeah,
that's it. That's the first one.
This is the one. Yeah,
yeah, that's it. I love that art collector or Nazi looter. It's really a question, you know. He had an entire hall of a new mansion built to house all this art, and then when the Russians were coming, he sort of packed it all into a load of trucks and ran off and burned the mansion down, and a lot of those are still missing. Though,
and his taste was broader than. I don't know why I'm saying broader. I don't know quite why I'm saying broader, but his taste was broader than Hitler's. Oh, Hitler, by the way, wanted to accumulate he wanted his personal collection to go to a Linz museum, which was near his hometown in Austria, which would basically be a repository for sort of the art treasures of the world.
And of course, the other big looter was von Ribbentrop, who kind of for his entire life had ambitions of being a kind of cultured, sort of aristocratic art collector sort of type. I mean, he as far as I know, he actually wasn't a von Ribbentrop. He added that to kind of get the credential. And yeah, he also did very similar things. They're much less kind of greedy than Goering was with it.
Classic Chapman brothers there.
Hitler actually was able to purchase. I mean, we talked about in one of the symbolist streams. We talked about Booklin's Isle of the Dead, which he did actually buy. I've heard 33, but I think it might also be 32. He actually bought that on the private art market, and he paid a reasonable price for it. And the reason he could afford that was because he was getting royalties from Mein Kampf, which was sort of mandated purchase, which made him extremely rich and gave him a large disposable income, which meant he could buy pictures on the open market. Although when it came to looting and plundering, he tended not to pay.
In fact, I believe the Mein Kampf sort of loophole was that all married couples received one for free, and then via some tax workout, they got billed for it, sort of through tax.
Yeah, they were given
which would then go personally to Hitler.
Brilliant. Okay, and then obviously with the and the resolution of the Second World War, the stolen art got returned. Or did it? Well,
some of it did.
Actually, I think it's about 20% of it has never been located.
Really,
most of it has gone. Most of it has gone back over the years. It's been slow. There have been some sort of caches that have been discovered. Some of it ended up going into Russia, going into the Soviet Union, and most of that has never been returned. Some of it actually is in the hands of the Russian state, but most of it has been returned. Nothing. But there is a museum. I can't remember where it is. It's in Switzerland, I think, which is holding a collection of art which they can't trace the owners of, the descendants of. But some of it was lost, including there was a famous Raphael portrait of a man, I think, that was lost. That was lost during the war, and it's never surfaced. Of course, the Amber Room, which we discussed in the last stream, is completely gone, probably destroyed. There was, and what happened was also when the Soviets got in, there was some unofficial looting by Soviet soldiers. And also, I think, by a few of the Allies, the Americans and the British as well, just taking things that they found and not reporting it. And so it was just sort of disappearing. So every so often you'll get like a Dura print sort of turning up in an attic in Ohio because some GI nicked it from somewhere.
Yeah.
I love it. Cletus having no idea the value of
because his grandfather.
Duroprint, just finds it inside there. That's brilliant.
Also should point out that the network of dealers who were involved in the plundering and the transfer and the auctioning, they had quite sort of easy return back into the art world in the 1940s and 50s and carried on dealing thereafter, so they didn't suffer any serious consequences.
It's interesting who sort of survives the Nazi period. The thorax guy that I was mentioning, he becomes a recluse after the Second World War. He survives into the 50s, up to 54, but basically lives out his life like totally depressed, basically, because he's just basically rejected by the whole of.
It's the same for Arno Brecker, another German. Arno Brecker is one of the figures you'll see in the famous photograph of Hitler in Paris, where he's standing next to the Champs-Élysées. Arno Brecker was like his guide. If you look at Eiffel Tower or something. So he was walking. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So the guy on the right. So I think that's Speer, Hitler, and Arno Brecker. Arno Brecker was his guide. Arno Brecker was an established sculptor who benefited from Nazi patronage, and he was a pretty decent artist. But he was kind of tarred with the Nazi slur. Well, it's not a slur. I mean, he was a Nazi, and here he is with Hitler. I mean, you can't really wrangle yourself out of that. So he had a very low key career afterwards. One of his most famous busts in the post-war period was of Salvador Dali, who he counted as a friend.
Interesting. You mentioned about that the card-carrying Nazi member that.
Yes,
he was the artist.
Emil
Mulder. He probably benefited from having his art in the Degenerate art. He probably, I guess, he had a successful career after the Second World War.
Afterwards he was kind of like. But the thing is that afterwards he was pro-Nazi, so he was stained as a pro-Nazi after the war, even though the Nazis had persecuted him, so he couldn't win.
Poor Nazi.
So it doesn't look as though we're going to get to the actual Nazi painters this stream, does it?
No. Shall we draw a line over it, under it for today, and maybe revisit some more of the actual artists?
Art of Darkness 3 coming soon.
And we could pad it out with some of the kind of maybe Spanish or Portuguese authoritarian artists as well. But is there any? Do you guys want to kind of say anything else before we kind of finish up?
No, I think we've covered the architecture and the plundering pretty well. Sorry. Just no. I'm going to save that till next time. So I think that's me done.
No, I don't have anything to say or anything to shill. I really enjoy these sorts of streams, and I hope that the audience did too. And as Alexander said, be sure to leave comments and questions and things, because we will respond to them.
And fortify the like ratio.
Yes.
Maximum malarkey.
Fortify the likes. In terms of shilling, Alex, you've got a new video that you've been doing in collaboration with the Glass.
Yes. Yeah, it's Glass Blind Spot. So if you go to the channel Glass Blind Spot, I've sent a link to Ferro in the chat.
It's in the description. It's in the description.
Oh, it's in the description. Oh, great. So this is a video, an interview that I did with Brian at Glass Blind Spot, and we talk about cultural entryism and the impact it's had on Doctor Who in specifically. And it's worth watching. Mainly for a weird audio quality, which appears in my interview, which sounds as though I'm broadcasting from the bowels of Hades.
I didn't know if that was intentional. I saw the first one where you're featured in for like 2 minutes at the end randomly.
The second's long one, yeah.
And And
Yeah.
it sounded like you'd been through like a filter, or it was kind of like artistically done, so you were kind of like on a spaceship or something like that. It was very, very strange. But
I mean, it's this sort of groaning, rumbling echo in the background, and I've got no idea what it is. It sounds as though, well, I mean, I am in Bristol, so I'm on the sliding down into hell.
You're on
You're still hanging on in there.
Yeah. So anyway, I recommend to visit that video and take a look. It's an hour long, but it discusses the way cultural entries get into various fandoms and distort and control and basically cause havoc.
Very good. And do you have any more articles in the Critic coming up, or that you're writing on, or do you have to just hold on?
There will be some new stuff coming up. There's nothing at the moment, so I would just say show your support by buying one of my or both of my 2 books, Culture War and Iconoclasm.
Brilliant. Just from my side, yeah. Thanks everyone for listening. Again, I think it's a really interesting comparison to the Italians. You know, very, very different approach, very different stylistic choices, but again, I think, you know, showing the importance of art as a way of projecting who you are, controlling people, controlling a narrative, and you know, trying to shape a people, really. So you know, some very, very powerful stuff. Like I said, we'll be around again in a couple of weeks' time. It's always a little bit last minute, but please subscribe, and when we do turn up, you can you'll be notified. But
by the way, the Saffron Simps should be excited, and I want them to subscribe, because we do have some artwork to show when we reach the 1,000 subscriptions.
Exactly. Yes, I've been working away over the last couple of weeks on some initial sketches. So again, once we reach 1,000 subscribers,
push that gimmick, push it,
and there'll be some original artwork. So thank you very much.
Go on. Sorry.
What were you going to say?
Tell all your friends about the Pharaoh channel. Send them the link. Make them subscribe. We need to see Pharaoh's artwork. This is an imperative. We absolutely have to get this out there.
Yeah,
it would definitely be. It's going to be classed as degenerate artwork by Hitler. So, guys,
but definitely not fascist art, I'm sure.
Exactly. And on that note, good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.